Logan got out on the sixth floor and walked down the corridor, hesitating a moment outside room 6035. Then he raised the keycard to the reader at the door. The light went green and he stepped inside. The room was dimly lit, but he had no difficulty finding the enticing creature who'd kissed him senseless in the bar and then made him break with every ounce of common sense he'd ever possessed. What was he doing, coming to a stranger's hotel room like this? The woman still wore her dress, but had slipped off the killer heels. "I'm glad you came," she said, walking towards him. She wound her arms around his neck and reached up to kiss him. Again, the intoxicating blend of her fragrance wafted gently around him, seducing his senses into believing that coming here was a very, very good idea. Logan felt his entire body go up in flames. He wanted her like he'd wanted nothing else. Regret, doubt, confusion. Those were all emotions for other people to worry about. Not him, not now, not here. He slid his arms around her waist and pulled her in closer. He didn't feel the need to speak, had no desire to break the spell. He deepened the kiss, letting his tongue slide between her lips and experiencing the stimulating taste that was uniquely this woman. She splayed her hands through his short-cropped hair, her nails gently raking his scalp and sending tiny electric jolts through his entire body. And then her hands were at his shoulders, sliding his leather jacket off and tugging at his shirt. He moved his hands to assist her and broke contact with her lips for only as long as it took him to tear the shirt up over his head and away from his overheated flesh. When their lips met again, he could feel the texture of her dress against his bare skin, but it wasn't enough. His hands slid around her back and up to the neckline of her dress, feeling for the zipper. Success! He caught the tab between a thumb and forefinger and slowly pulled it down. Logan wrenched his mouth from hers and stepped away, not wanting to miss a moment of this reveal. At first the woman looked coy, as if she had suddenly grown shy. But then as he watched, she lifted her hands to her shoulders and shrugged the top of her dress loose before letting it slide down her body. His breath caught in his throat at the sight of her. Honey gold skin gleamed in the low light of the hotel room. Her breasts swelled and spilled over the half cup of her black bra, and a matching pair of briefs slung high on her hips made her legs look as if they went on forever. He swallowed against the sudden dryness in his mouth and stepped forward. He started to reach for her, his hands hesitating only an inch or so from her body. He could feel the heat pouring off of her, a heat matched by his own. "May I?" he asked. She smiled and ducked her head in a faint nod. It was all the encouragement he needed. He cupped her breasts through the lacy bra and thumbed the hard peaks of her nipples. A tiny gasp fell from the mystery woman's lips, and he captured it in another kiss. He couldn't seem to get enough of her. He eased the straps of her bra shoulder off her shoulders and pulled down one cup. Her nipple was a taut bud, and he pinched it lightly between his forefinger and his thumb. He felt the tremor that rippled through her. "Is that okay?" he asked, his voice little more than a growl. "More," she begged him. He repeated the movement, then lowered his head to capture that deep rose-pink nub of flesh with his lips. Again she shook and sighed. He laved her nipple with his tongue before nipping it lightly. "More," she demanded now, her hands holding his head to her as if she couldn't bear for him to stop. And nor could he. Everything about her called to him. Her scent, her taste, her husky pleas that were driving him mad. This all felt like some crazy dream, but he knew he didn't want to wake up. Reality would come back to bite him soon enough. For now, he'd take what he'd been freely offered, and he'd give in return. Logan backed her against the bed and eased her onto the mattress. He stood between her legs and unbuckled his belt before kicking off his shoes and sliding down his jeans and socks. He didn't trust himself to remove his briefs just yet. Right now he felt as though he was primed and ready to blow. Her slightest touch would be his undoing, and there was no way he was wasting this opportunity. First of all, He was going to make absolutely certain that his mystery woman was with him all the way. He hooked his fingers in the sides of her panties and slid them down her long, glorious legs. A neat triangle of dark blonde hair nestled at the apex of her thighs. He hadn't seen anything quite as sexy in a very long time. Logan lowered himself over her body and reached under her to unsnap the fastening of her bra before easing the confection of lace away from her skin. "Has anyone ever told you how exquisitely beautiful you are?" he asked, skimming his hand lightly over the peaks of her breasts before cupping their full weight and squeezing gently. "Only you," she said in a hoarse whisper, her eyelids fluttering close as he began to kiss her breasts. She was writhing beneath him, her hips straining against his. It was all he could do not to unleash his arousal and take her right then, but he was determined to do this right, to ensure she found her pleasure before he even considered taking his. He kissed a warm, wet trail down over her ribcage and to the center of her stomach before drawing a moist line to her belly button with his tongue. He swirled the tip of his tongue in the neat indentation before continuing lower. He knelt on the floor beside the bed and leaned into her. His nostrils flared on the heated, musky scent of her sex, and a pulse of demand bolted through him. He'd never been as completely aware of another human being as he was of this woman. He gently cupped the heated core of her body and felt her push against his palm, striving for more pressure. "Impatient?" he asked softly. He took his hand away and blew a stream of air over her mound and lower still. Her skin there glistened with moisture, and the waves of heat that poured off her almost scorched his fingertips as he let them drift around her entrance. "You're torturing me," she moaned as he dipped one finger inside her. "But it's a nice kind of torture, right?" She clenched tight around him, and for a second all Logan could think about was what that tension would feel like around his penis. But it wasn't his time yet. First, he had to have her trembling with satisfaction, and then he would lift her back up to the heights of physical pleasure all over again. He pressed his nose against her mound and inhaled her deeply, feeling her in every part of him. Then, using his tongue, he began to tease at her clitoris. At first, it was just small darts of pressure, but then he began to swirl his tongue around the tight bead of nerve endings. Her breathing grew more rapid, and he looked up at her. Her head was pressed back against the mattress, and a light sheen of perspiration made her chest glisten. A rosy flush was spreading there, and her nipples had drawn even more impossibly tight than they'd been before. Logan eased another finger inside her, stroking her inside and driving her toward what he hoped would be her ultimate satisfaction. He never stopped with the movements of his tongue, and then, when he felt she was on the verge of breaking apart, he closed his mouth around her clit and drew on it hard. She fractured beneath him. Her inner muscles squeezed his fingers in a rhythmic pulse that drove him wild. He waited until her body went lax before he moved. "I didn't know you had that in you," she said in a voice laden with satisfaction. "Oh, I've got more." He reached for his trousers, slipped his wallet from his pocket, and dragged a condom out. It might be a cliché, but it always paid to be prepared. He quickly slid off his briefs and covered his length with the condom before standing, hooking her knees with his hands and scooting her to the edge of the bed. "You still okay?" he said. He'd stop here and now if she said no. It would likely be the toughest thing he'd ever done in his life, but he'd do it. "Never better," she answered. "Do it. Do me." He smiled as he positioned himself at her entrance. She was slick with her recent orgasm, and he was inside her in one easy glide. Logan squeezed his eyes shut and held on to the last remnants of his control as he felt her body adjust around him. "What are you waiting for?" she asked, giving him a squeeze with her internal muscles. "This," he said as he withdrew and surged back into her again. At this point, everything blurred. There was nothing else in the world except her body and his, joined in the most intimate way a man and a woman could be joined. He pumped into her, and she met his every thrust with one of her own. Her breath came in gasps, and her hands clutched the bedding beneath her. Logan forced his eyes open, forced himself to look at her, to imprint her image like this beneath him, as lost in him as he was lost in her. He saw that flush creep over her chest again and knew she was close to coming. He had to see her into that sea of pleasure before he could let go. The pulse started deep inside her body, growing stronger with every surge until she peaked, and with it he reached his climax too. Again and again his pleasure rocketed through him, deep, intense, and fiercely satisfying on a primal level. Logan lowered himself onto her and rolled them both onto their sides. He was still inside her, could still feel her body in his, hearts beating to their perfect rhythm as their pleasure began to ebb and reality began to take its place. The woman raised one hand to his face, tracing his features and looking deep into his eyes. "I didn't know we could be like this," she said. "That was... no, you were perfect." "We were perfect," he agreed. He kissed her then, long and deep and slow. This wasn't the kind of thing he'd ever done before, but they'd both been willing partners, and together they'd found a perfection not many had the pleasure of reaching on their first time together. "First and last," he reminded himself. He withdrew from her body, and they lay there, their hearts and breathing returning to a normal tempo. He needed to clean up, so he rose from the bed and went through to the bathroom. When he returned, he noticed immediately that she had pulled the covers over herself and fallen fast asleep. While his instincts urged him to join her there, he saw the dismissal in her actions. She'd had an itch, and he'd scratched it. No harm, no foul. Logan reached for his clothing and quickly dressed. Leaving her keycard on the bedside table, he switched off the light before letting himself out of the room. He'd never see her again, but he'd never forget her, or this night, for as long as he lived. Well, my fingers do space giraffe cookies for you.